SeaMan, Chapter 8, Guard Dog and Backpacker, May 25th through July 1805. While SeaMan was recovering, the countryside was changing. Leaving the grassy plains, the boats entered an area as dry as a desert. On each side of the river, the land rose into sandy cliffs. Sand blew into the explorers' faces, stinging their eyes and sticking to their skin. In this remote area, the explorers caught their first glimpse of the shining mountains the Indians had described. Looking toward the west, they could see the distant Rockies gleaming white in the sunshine. Although the mountains were a beautiful sight, the men shivered. They knew those shining peaks were covered with snow. Somehow, the Corps of Discovery would have to cross those frozen peaks to reach the western sea. The river twisted around endless curves, and the jagged cliffs slashed straight down into the water on both sides of the river. A strong downstream wind always blew. The men found they could not sail or paddle the boats against this wind and current, so they pulled the boats with ropes. They cut their feet on the rocky river bottom as they trudged through the water. Their ropes dried out and snapped, and the white pirogue was nearly lost once again, this time in the rocky water. As soon as the explorers solved one problem, another arose to slow their progress. As they continued west, the explorers recognized the area the Indians called the White Cliffs. Sandstone cliffs towered above them, 200 feet and higher. Their weathered surfaces were chipped and pitted. They looked like the windowed walls of ancient ruins. Although the men were very tired, they marveled at this stark scenery. It was as different from the green rolling landscape of the eastern United States as any place they could imagine. During the night of May 29th, when everyone was sound asleep except one night guard, a buffalo accidentally blundered into camp. The great hulk of a bull swam across the river and climbed right over the white pirogue, which was beached on the riverbank with both captains sleeping in it. Luckily, the massive animal, which weighed a ton or more, did not fall on the boat. The captains were not even roused by the sound of its hooves crunching on the stony beach. 4 campfires were burning in the nearby camp, and the flickering blazes confused the bull. It snorted, terrified. Its sides twitched, and it stamped its hooves on the rocky ground. In a frantic search for an escape from the strange place, it began to run, swerving wildly from side to side. SeaMan was dozing beside the guard by one of the campfires. Hearing the noise, he began to bark. In the darkness, the guard called out, but the man could not figure out what was causing the commotion. Some of the explorers sat up, dazed with sleep. Others rolled over and reached for their firearms. The bull's panic increased as the darkened shapes on the ground began to move. It stampeded through the camp, trampling on a rifle and a gun. Its hooves came within inches of sleeping men's heads. Desperate to escape, it lowered its head and charged toward the tent where the sergeants, as well as Charbonneau, Sacagawea, and the baby, slept. SeaMan dashed through the camp, barking ferociously. The buffalo was only a few yards away from ramming into the tent when SeaMan caught up with it. Growling and snapping at the bull's heels, SeaMan turned the buffalo away from the tent and drove it out of camp. When SeaMan returned to camp, everyone was awake. Men were checking the sleeping rolls to be sure nobody had been trampled. Miraculously, not a single person had been injured, and only a few firearms had been damaged. "SeaMan, I don't know what we would do without you," Shannon exclaimed, spreading out his arms to hug the dog. SeaMan jumped up, put its front paws on Shannon's chest, and licked the young man's face. Then he trotted around the camp. Inside the tent, the dog spotted Charbonneau, who was muttering sleepily. The sergeants patted SeaMan gratefully, delighted by their good fortune. Sacagawea's baby had not even awakened. Lewis called SeaMan to his side and stroked his head. "Thank God nobody was trampled by that beast," he said. "You saved our lives tonight, SeaMan." For the next few weeks, SeaMan's barking often woke the explorers during the night. In the mornings, the men sometimes discovered buffalo herds near the outskirts of camp. Occasionally, they spotted signs of grizzly. No matter how often the barking woke them up, none of the explorers ever complained. SeaMan had become the camp's guard. The explorers proceeded on until they reached a fork in the river. Here the men stopped, puzzled. The river from the north was muddy. The river from the south was clear. Which waterway was the Missouri River? The men made camp and discussed the matter. The captains thought the clear river from the south was the Missouri, and the river coming down from the north was only a tributary. Everyone else disagreed, thinking the muddy river must be the Missouri. Finally, the captains decided to take scouting parties to explore both rivers. As soon as Lewis and his 6 scouts packed their gear for the trip, he called SeaMan. He knelt and stroked the dog's chest. Then he walked over to Sacagawea with the dog by his side. "Sit, SeaMan," Lewis said. SeaMan sat obediently. He cocked his head and looked at Lewis. "That's right, SeaMan. Stay," Lewis said firmly. He told Sacagawea, "Be sure SeaMan stays in camp with you for a few hours." Sacagawea looked puzzled. "The dog's leg is better," she said. "He is strong now." "Yes, he's strong enough to run with my scouting party, but SeaMan is the best night guard we have," Lewis explained. "Remember the night the buffalo stampeded through camp? Most of our people and all of our supplies will be here in camp. The dog should stay to keep you safe." Sacagawea nodded and smiled. She laid her hand on SeaMan's head. Clark's scouting party returned on June 6th, and Lewis's party returned on the 8th. The captains were convinced the Northern River was a tributary running out of the Northern Prairie and not the Missouri River, which was believed to flow out of the Rocky Mountains. But the others still thought the Missouri was the Northern River. The captains decided to send out another scouting party to find a major landmark, the Missouri's gigantic waterfalls, which the Indians at Fort Mandan had described. As soon as they found those falls, they would know they were on the right river. The plan was for Lewis to lead the scouting party to find the waterfalls. Once he found Great Falls, Lewis would be in charge of deciding the best land route around it. Since the boats could not travel up the waterfalls, the men would have to portage, carrying all their boats and supplies overland. Again, Lewis insisted on leaving SeaMan in camp as a guard. "Meriwether," Clark declared, "I fear you're going to break your dog's heart." With my scouting party arrived back in camp, SeaMan was moping around, looking miserable. Lewis called SeaMan to his side and knelt to gaze into the dog's deep brown eyes. "SeaMan," Lewis said, "your job is to guard our camp. It's a very important job. Your senses are so keen that you're the best guard we have." SeaMan's tail swished back and forth along the ground. He nuzzled Lewis's hand. Lewis turned to Clark. "William, I'd love to take SeaMan with me, but I promised President Jefferson I'd give my life, if necessary, to make this expedition a success, and I meant it. The camp is safer when SeaMan is here. He needs to stay." So it was decided. On June 11th, Lewis took 4 men to explore the Southern River, and SeaMan remained with Clark. In camp, the men began to prepare for the portage around Great Falls. To lighten their load, they divided their supplies, some to be taken on the trip west, and the rest to be stored in a cache. The men dug a large hole to make the cache. They left some tightly sealed kegs of dried food and a keg of salt in the hole. They also left heavy tools, like the blacksmith bellows, some of the guns, and gunpowder. Since the pierogies were too big and awkward for travel in the smaller headwaters of the Missouri, the men left one of them on top of the cache. They planned to leave the second pierogi in another cache farther upriver. They threw dirt and branches and leaves on the pile and concealed it so neither animals nor Indians would find the supplies. The men planned to pick up the pierogies and the supplies on their return trip. Lewis's scouting party found the Great Falls of the Missouri on June 13th. It was even more spectacular than the Indians had described. In his journal, Lewis called it the grandest sight I ever beheld. As soon as he located this landmark, Lewis knew that he and Clark had been correct. The Southern River, the Clear River, was the Missouri. Unfortunately, Great Falls was not a single waterfall. Instead, it was 5 separate, mighty waterfalls with rapids between them. This was very bad news, because it meant the men would have to carry the boats and supplies much farther than they expected, nearly 20 miles over rough ground. As Lewis returned to camp, SeaMan ran to meet him. He barked excitedly. Lewis put out his hand to stroke the dog, but SeaMan turned and dashed away, leading the men toward camp. He stopped several yards down the trail and barked again. His barks were short, loud, and urgent. Lewis was at first puzzled by SeaMan's behavior. Suddenly he understood. "Something's wrong!" He shouted to the men in his scouting party. They began to run, following SeaMan toward camp. Clark greeted the party with the bad news. "It's Sacagawea," he explained, a worried look on his face. "She took ill after you left. It seemed to be her stomach. I've tried everything I could think of, but she doesn't seem any better." Striding quickly to the tent with SeaMan by his side, Lewis was alarmed by what he found. Sacagawea was very weak, with a high fever and strained breathing. She said she had awful pains in her abdomen. SeaMan licked the young woman's face, nuzzling her gently. She smiled faintly and reached a weak hand up to pat the dog's chest. As he examined the Indian woman, Lewis recalled Sergeant Floyd, who had died with a stomach complaint in the early months of their journey. None of their remedies had saved the young sergeant, and all of the men were greatly saddened by his death. Now the captain prayed for the skill to save this young Indian mother. Since he did not know the cause of her illness, Lewis treated Sacagawea by restricting her diet to mineral water from a nearby spring. To relieve the pain, he laid warm, moist cloths on her abdomen and gave her medicines that he had brought on the journey. He watched her carefully, responding to each of her symptoms. He had tried a similar approach on Sergeant Floyd, but this time, to everybody's relief, Lewis's doctoring seemed to help. While Sacagawea slowly grew stronger, the men took turns caring for her son. By now, Jean-Baptiste was a healthy, fat 4-month-old. His little round face and his funny gurgling sounds enchanted everybody in the Corps. York moistened the parched corn they had brought from Fort Mandan to make mush for him to eat. The men played peekaboo with him while York fed him with a spoon. If the baby squirmed, SeaMan darted to his side and licked his chubby toes. Whenever he had a minute, Captain Clark picked the baby up and bounced him gently on his knee. If the baby cried, Clark held him close against his shoulder while he hummed tunes from his own nursery days. The baby usually had such a serious expression on his face that Clark nicknamed him Pomp. Soon, all the explorers called him Pomp. During Sacagawea's illness, the men got ready for the portage. Fortunately, after the expedition had left the White Cliffs, they entered grassy countryside again. Small trees grew along the banks of the river, and the men cut them down for wood to make into wagons. They sawed cross-sections from the trunk of a cottonwood tree to get large wooden circles that could be used as wheels. Then they loaded supplies onto their makeshift wagons. They were going to have to push, pull, or carry the wagons nearly 20 miles around the falls to reach a place where the river's waters were calm enough for boats again. They also made a second cache of supplies and left the white pirogue in it. One evening in camp, Lewis called SeaMan. Lewis was holding leather saddlebags, 2 pouches held together by straps and buckles. "Stand, boy, stay." Lewis had sewn an extra strap between the pouches so the saddlebags could be worn like a harness, with one strap over SeaMan's back, another that buckled around his belly, and a third strap that ran across his chest. "Let's see if you'll put up with these saddlebags, SeaMan. The men can use all the help they can get with the portage." Lewis let SeaMan sniff the leather saddlebags. Then he slipped the dog's head through the straps. Lewis knelt and pulled the chest strap into place. The pouches hung against SeaMan's sides from the strap over his back. Lewis buckled the belly strap loosely around SeaMan's middle. SeaMan jerked his head around and chewed the belly strap, trying to yank it off. "No, SeaMan," Lewis said firmly. "Stand still." SeaMan looked at Lewis. He whined and wagged his tail. Lewis took up some of the slack in the belly strap. Then he stuffed a few pieces of clothing in the pouches to give them a little weight. He backed up and called, "Come, SeaMan." SeaMan took a step forward, then hesitated. He looked over his shoulders at the saddlebags. "That's a good boy, SeaMan," Lewis said encouragingly. "Come." SeaMan took a few more steps, glancing back at the pouches on either side of him. He finally reached Lewis and started to sit, but he sprang up when he felt the saddlebags touch his thighs. He studied Lewis's face, trying to figure out how to play this new game. "It's all right, fellow," Lewis said, and stroked SeaMan's head and back. He put a hand on SeaMan's rump and sat him down. "That's not so bad, is it?" Lewis placed a small metal tool in each of the pouches. Then he walked a few yards away and again told SeaMan to come. The dog jumped up and trotted over. The saddlebags jiggled from side to side as he moved. This time, SeaMan reached Lewis and sat with no hesitation. Lewis knelt down and stroked SeaMan. "What a smart boy you are." SeaMan licked Lewis's face. You're going to help us carry supplies on the portage, SeaMan." Lewis loaded up the saddlebags and let SeaMan practice carrying them several times. As soon as SeaMan got used to the feel of the saddlebags against his fur, he trotted along cheerfully. He hardly noticed the weight of the pouches. Each time they practiced, Lewis walked farther away before telling SeaMan to come. Finally, Lewis led SeaMan to the edge of a small stand of trees. He told SeaMan to stay and walk through trees and brush. Then he called, "Come, SeaMan." SeaMan sprang forward to follow Lewis. The bulky saddlebags brushed against some branches, and SeaMan stopped, puzzled. He looked back at the pouches and started walking again. Suddenly, SeaMan could not move. He had followed Lewis into a narrow space between 2 trees, but the saddlebags made him too wide to fit through. SeaMan barked once, then whined. Lewis chuckled. "You've got to leave more room for yourself when you're carrying loaded saddlebags, SeaMan." He started back to help the dog. SeaMan backed up and darted around the trees, running to Lewis. Lewis smiled. Now you've got it figured out. Smart boy. He tapped his chest, and SeaMan bounded to him and jumped up, resting his paws lightly on Lewis's chest. Lewis threw his arms around the dog, letting SeaMan lick his face. Wait till the men see you carrying these saddlebags, SeaMan. The next morning, Lewis packed up the saddlebags and buckled them around SeaMan. When SeaMan joined the men, his tail was wagging proudly. Coulter was the first to notice. SeaMan, you're carrying a backpack, he said, smiling. SeaMan panted, his mouth wide open as if he were grinning, and patted over to Coulter, who smoothed the velvety fur on top of the dog's head. The other men called SeaMan over to stroke him or to give him chunks of dried meat. Of all the explorers, SeaMan was the only one who seemed to be looking forward to the portage. The portage was exhausting. Hour after hour, day after day, the explorers trudged across the rough ground. Sweat poured off their foreheads and pasted their clothes to their backs. The wagons got stuck and had to be yanked out of holes. Wheels fell off, axles broke. Countless times each day, the men had to stop to repair the crude wagons and reload their supplies. SeaMan walked alongside the men and their wagons, his saddlebags stuffed with supplies. The weight didn't bother him at all, but he was bothered by the prickly pear cactus growing all over the uneven ground. The plant's long, stiff spines stuck in the pads of his paws. SeaMan chewed and pulled out the larger spines, but his pads became covered with finer spines that stung whenever he walked. Sometimes the pain made him yelp. The cactus spines pierced the soles of the men's leather moccasins and cut their feet. The men sewed double layers of leather on the bottoms of their moccasins, but still their footwear would last only 2 days. Their feet became sore and bloody. The sight of SeaMan working beside them encouraged the weary men. As soon as they reached the river and the men unloaded SeaMan's bags, he leaped into the water. The cool water soothed his sore paws. Some of the men followed his example and jumped in, soaking their tired muscles for a few minutes before walking back to camp to load up more supplies. At last, the painful portage was finished, but the explorers could not yet get back in the boats. Since they had left the pierogies behind in the caches, they needed to make more canoes to carry everyone. So the men searched for large trees, cut them down, and hollowed out the insides to make dugout canoes. It took a month for the explorers to portage their supplies and make new canoes, and in that month, they traveled only about 20 miles up the river. On July 15th, the Corps of Discovery was finally ready to continue. The explorers had 8 sturdy canoes, 2 large and 6 smaller. Their supplies had been trimmed down to essentials. The men's sore feet were healing. Sacagawea was healthy again, and little Pomp was safely strapped to the board on her back. New fur covered the scar where SeaMan's beaver wound had been. Now the explorers turned their thoughts to the shining mountains. All they had to do was cross the Rockies, they thought. Then they would race downstream to the sea.